Hey everybody, as I'm sure you've heard by now, we are not going to be meeting for the rest of the semester face-to-face, and I'm pretty bummed about that, but we're going to make the best of it. So I'm going to try to experiment with making videos and so forth. So I want to talk today about the next chapter that we're going to be doing, which is Prejudice. And as a way of introducing the topic, I wanted to talk about some research or an idea, I guess, by a guy named Thomas Schelling that I read about many, many years ago. Thomas Schelling was an economist who won a Nobel Prize for some of his work. He wrote a book called Micromotives and Macro Behavior. And kind of the punchline of that book is that small preferences, subtle preferences that people have at the individual level can manifest themselves sometimes in unexpected ways at the collective or group level. And I wanted to walk you through a little demonstration of how this can play itself out. So I'm gonna pause here for a sec and then move my camera. Okay, hopefully what you can see here is a checkerboard kind of with 64 numbers on it. What I want you to do is imagine that this grid is a neighborhood or a community, and each of these numbers represents a house on the community. And let's say in this community there are two groups of people. There are dimes and pennies, because that's what I have sitting around my house. And okay, so if we were to talk about what racism looks like, what prejudice looks like, you might say, okay, picture a highly segregated culture, like maybe the US South in the 1920s, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So you might think, okay, what would the neighborhoods look like if the norm in that society was like all the pennies and all the paper and all the dimes didn't get along, didn't like each other? Not surprisingly, you would find that they would probably say there's complete segregation between these two communities, right? So all the dimes would live on one side. So each of these dimes has their own house. We could keep playing this out, and all the pennies on this side, and there would be complete segregation. That's not surprising. And if someone were to come to this community, they would easily figure out what the kind of social attitudes of this community is. But that's not the world we live in. The world we live in today is a much more complex place, and most people would argue that that's not the way things are. That in fact today, if we look at, for instance, racial attitudes in the United States, most people would say, I'm not racist. I don't mind having neighbors who are of a different race than me. In fact, I've looked at recent survey data. Virtually all white people in the United States now report that they would be willing to live next door to a black family. But at the same time, you still get attitudes like 70% report saying, this is white people saying that they would move away if black people came to their neighborhood in great numbers. 50% would object if their children went to a school where more than half the children were black. And so what we live in society today is where most people at the individual level would say, I'm comfortable with people of a different race, but how far does that comfort go? So let's say instead of a norm where the dimes and the pennies hate each other, it's a little more complex. Let's say the norm in this community that we're creating here is one where the dimes and the pennies by and large get along and like each other okay, but they express attitudes like I just explained. So dimes say, I just want to live in a neighborhood where at least half of my neighbors are dimes just like me, and pennies say the same thing. So if I just randomly, for a second, distribute these, and then we're going to move people around in a bit here. Let me just randomly make sure everybody's got their own home in our community. And I've left a few empty squares for empty houses. Now let's look at this neighborhood. If the norm is what I just said, that everybody wants to live in a neighborhood where at least half of their neighbors are like themselves, That doesn't sound like blatant racism, but it does sound like maybe there's a slight bias. Well, you can look at this pattern already and you can say, well, some people are going to be unhappy with their current living arrangements, and we can move those people around to some of the open homes. So if we just look around here, we could look at some numbers here. So number 19, for instance, is surrounded by more dimes than pennies. So let's move 19 into a place where she's going to be more comfortable, maybe over here in 56. We can look at number 63, and maybe 63 is not comfortable, so maybe we move 63 over here. And we can keep doing this. Number 50 would be more comfortable living over here. Let's say number 39 is uncomfortable, so maybe we move to 19 now. Looks like number 11 is uncomfortable. Let's move 11 to over here somewhere. 38 is uncomfortable. You can see what's happening. If we play this out to its logical conclusion, we're going to get to a place that looks pretty much indistinguishable from the community I mentioned earlier, where there's great hatred between the two groups, right? And now this person's unhappy, so we need to move them. We're going to find basically complete segregation. These people are going to keep moving out. And so if you were an alien flying over this community and you were trying to observe, what do you think the norms of this community are? You would say, maybe they hate each other. We don't know. The point is that, and this is the punchline of this demonstration, which is the punchline of the book that I was mentioning earlier, small, subtle preferences at the individual level. Just the idea that I just want at least half of my neighbors to be like myself can manifest themselves into large consequences at the group level. So what are the implications of this? The implications of this is that sometimes, a couple of implications. One, it's hard to see by just looking at collective behavior, like segregation, what people's individual underlying attitudes are. But I think another implication of this is that a lot of people can deny racial prejudice as a problem. They say it no longer exists. But even the very, very small and subtle attitude differences can manifest themselves at the collective level in pretty big and important ways. So I'm going to leave you with that, and then next I'll present you with slides for the prejudice unit.